They thought I was just the maid. Until I became the only witness who could destroy them.
She did not cry when they threw her out. That was the part no one understood about Nora Vell. Not the restaurant manager who grabbed her arm and steered her toward the service exit like she was something that needed to be removed. Not the two line cooks who watched from behind the stainless steel counter and said nothing. Not the couple at table 14 who glanced up for half a second before returning to their lobster bisque. Nobody cried in front of people who had already decided you did not matter. Nora had learned that a long time ago. The back door of the Harrington Grill swung shut behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. December air hit her face sharp and immediate, the kind of cold that did not ease into you but arrived all at once. The alley behind the restaurant smelled like kitchen grease and wet concrete and the faint sweetness of garbage that had been sitting too long. Her apron was still tied around her waist. She had not even had time to take it off. She stood there for a moment just breathing. Inside her coat pocket, her phone buzzed. She already knew who it was. The school nurse had called twice during her shift. Leo had a fever of 102. He needed to be picked up. He needed children's acetaminophen, which cost $4.80 at the corner pharmacy, 3 blocks from their apartment. $4.80 that Nora did not currently have in her wallet because she had spent her last $12 on bus passes for the week. She had asked Marcus Webb, the shift manager, for $40 against her next paycheck. Just $40. She had been working at the Harrington for 11 months without a single sick day, without a single complaint, without once asking for anything extra. $40. He had looked at her the way certain people look at a stain on carpet, something to be dealt with, something inconvenient. The advance was against policy, he told her. And then he told her something else quietly just for her in the small office off the kitchen where nobody could see. He told her that maybe she needed to reconsider whether a place like the Harrington was really right for someone in her situation. Her situation. He said it like it was a medical condition, like poverty was something contagious, and he did not want it spreading through his dining room. She had nodded. She had thanked him. She had walked back to the floor and finished her tables and cleared plates and smiled at people who did not look at her face. And then, at the end of the shift, she asked again, because Leo's fever was real and the pharmacy closed at 9, and she had no other options. He had her escorted out. Now she stood in the alley behind the most expensive restaurant in Lincoln Park, 37 years old, still wearing her work apron in December. And she thought about her children. Rosie was 8, and Finn was 10, and Mia was 6, and Leo was 4, and none of them had chosen any of this. None of them had chosen a father who was gone or a mother who worked 3 jobs and still could not get $40 ahead of herself. None of them had chosen the apartment with the window that let in cold air. No matter how much tape she put around the frame, or the school shoes that were one size too small because new ones were not in the budget this month. She thought about Leo's fever. She thought about Mia's shoes. She thought about Finn, who had stopped asking for things the way children ask for things and had started observing what was available and adjusting his expectations accordingly, which was not something a 10-year-old should have to do, but which he did with a quiet dignity that made Nora's chest ache every time she noticed it. She thought about Rosie, who read everything she could get her hands on and had recently informed Nora that the library let you take out 12 books at a time, and that 12 was exactly the right number because it meant you never ran out. She thought about what it cost to raise 4 people on nothing and what it did to the person doing the raising, and whether the damage was visible from the outside or only from the inside. She took off her apron, folded it carefully, and put it in her bag. Then she walked out of the alley and toward the bus stop. She did not notice the black car parked across the street. She did not notice the man inside it watching her. Not yet. The Harrington Grill occupied the ground floor of a building that also contained 12 floors of luxury condominiums, a private members lounge, and the corporate offices of Delano Properties, which owned approximately 40% of the commercial real estate in Lincoln Park and had interests in 6 other Chicago neighborhoods besides. The man who owned Delano Properties had been at the restaurant that evening for a private dinner with 2 of his architects. He had ordered the duck. He had barely touched it. His name was Marcus Delano, and he was 43 years old, and he had a way of sitting in a room that made other people aware of exactly how much space he was choosing not to take up. I was not a large man in the way that people expected powerful men to be large. He was broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else with the kind of stillness that came not from calm, but from discipline. Sharp blue eyes trained over decades to see what other people missed. A jaw set against pain enough times that it had forgotten how to fully relax. He walked with a slight unevenness in his left leg, the result of a bullet that had passed through his thigh 14 months ago during what his official report described as an attempted robbery. His doctors had cleared him for full activity. His physical therapist was less certain. I had watched the entire thing from table 7, and he had watched the shift manager grab the woman's arm. He had watched the line cooks do nothing. He had watched her walk across that dining room floor with $40 worth of dignity and twice that in grief, and he had watched her disappear through the service exit, and he had sat with it for a moment the way he sat with most things, quietly and completely, before he set down his fork and excused himself from the table. His driver had the car running by the time he reached the door. He did not entirely understand why he had gone to the door. He had witnessed unkindness before. He had seen things in his professional life that made a callous shift manager look almost charming by comparison. But there was something about the way she had walked back across that floor after being denied back to her tables, back to her plates, back to the performance of normalcy required of people in her position, that had lodged itself in the specific place in his chest where things lodge when he could not reason them out. She had not looked defeated. She had looked determined. Those were completely different things, and most people did not know the difference. But Marcus Delano had spent his entire life learning to read the difference. Noravelle, the employment file would show him by morning, had worked at the Harrington for 11 months. Before that, a hotel on Michigan Avenue. Before that, a catering company that had gone under. 3 children enrolled in Chicago public schools. 1 more below school age. Single mother. Apartment in Bridgeport. No criminal record. No debt beyond what she owed in rent. No family support structure visible in the file. No one who seemed to be looking out for her. He read it at 6 in the morning with his coffee in the study on the 4th floor of the house on Astor Street, and then he put it down and looked at it from a distance and thought about what the file did not say, which was everything that mattered about living the life the file described. The file said single mother. It did not say what it cost to be a single mother in December in Chicago with 4 children and an 11-month employment history that showed no sick days and no complaints and no raises. I thought about the way she had folded her apron before she walked out of that alley. The care of it, the precision, the refusal to let even that small thing become undignified. And I made 2 phone calls before 7. The first was to the Harrington's general manager. Marcus Webb was no longer employed at the Harrington Grill by 8:15 that morning. The second call was to Sylvie, his household manager, who had worked for the Delano family for 19 years and had the quality of someone who asked very few questions because she had learned that the important answers came without them. By 9, a position had been created. Noravelle received a phone call at 9:47 while she was sitting in the waiting room of a walk-in clinic with Leo asleep against her shoulder, his small body radiating heat, his breathing even but slightly labored. The number was unfamiliar. The woman on the other end introduced herself as the household coordinator for a private residence in the Gold Coast. There was a housekeeping position available. Live out. The hours were flexible around school schedules. The salary she named was more than Nora made across all 3 of her jobs combined. Nora was quiet for a long moment. She asked the woman to repeat the number. The woman repeated it. Nora looked down at Leo's face against her shoulder. The small, damp weight of him, the warmth that meant his body was fighting something. The pharmacist had given her the acetaminophen this morning on credit, just $4.80, and had written her name in a small notebook he kept under the counter for people he trusted to come back. She thought about that notebook. She thought about what it meant to be a name in a notebook like that, to be someone a man extended credit to on a $4.80 because he had seen your face enough times to know you would return. She thought about 12 books from the library. She thought about Finn adjusting his expectations. She said she would come for an interview that afternoon. The address was on Astor Street. She had never been on Astor Street. The house was not what she expected, which was already something because she had spent 11 months working in one of the finest restaurants in Lincoln Park, and she thought she understood what expensive looked like. But the Delano residence did not look expensive the way the Harrington looked expensive. The Harrington looked expensive the way things looked expensive when they wanted you to know it. All glass and chrome and light fixtures that cost more than cars, everything designed to register immediately and be recognized immediately and produce a specific response in the people looking at it. The Delano residence looked expensive, the way old things looked expensive. Stone and iron and hedges trimmed to within a precise understanding of their own shape. A gate that opened without sound. A driveway that curved before it arrived. The kind of house that had existed long enough to stop needing to announce itself. Sylvie walked her through the position without condescension and without the specific particular warmth that people deployed when they wanted something from you. She was professional. She was clear. The duties were reasonable. The schedule was consistent. The household ran on routine, and there were rules about the private areas and rules about discretion and rules about the children if Nora brought them on days when school was not in session, which Sylvie indicated would be permitted given the circumstances, phrased in a way that told Nora her circumstances were known without telling her how they had been known. Nora agreed to the terms. She did not ask who owned the house. She was not ready for that answer yet. She found out the following morning when she arrived at 7 with Rosie and Finn and Mia and Leo because the school district had declared a snow day and she had no one to leave them with. The children came in quiet and well-behaved, and they all kept their coats on in the entrance hall, while Nora talked them through the rules of the space, her voice low and precise. And they listened because they understood in the way children understood things, when they had been taught that other people's spaces required respect, even when your own space required very little of anyone. She was explaining to Leo that the vases on the console table were not for touching when she heard footsteps on the staircase. She recognized him immediately. It was the man from table 7, the one who had been sitting in the corner of the Harrington 2 nights ago, in the booth near the window. The one she had registered with the peripheral part of her attention that was always running, noting him not because of what he was, but because of the quality of his presence, the way a room arranged itself slightly around someone without being asked to. She had not known who he was. She had not looked at him long enough to look at him. Now she looked at him. He stopped on the last step, and his blue eyes moved to Rosie first, and something happened in them that Nora could not name. It lasted less than a second, a recognition that should not have been possible, a stillness that arrived inside his already very still face and sat there for a moment before his expression returned to what it normally was, which was contained and unreadable and entirely controlled. Then he looked at Nora, and his expression remained what it always was, and he said good morning in a voice that assumed it would be acknowledged. Good morning, Nora said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced being steady. He said nothing else. He continued through the entrance hall toward his study, his cane making a quiet sound against the marble floor, and the morning began. She learned the house methodically. She had always learned spaces this way, as tools first before they became familiar, understanding the function of each room before she allowed herself to have any feelings about it. She learned which hallways the security staff used and at what intervals. She learned that Marcus Delano drank black coffee from the same white cup every morning and read physical newspapers, 3 of them folded to specific sections in a specific order: the financial section of one, and the national news of another, and the local section of the third. She learned that he had a physical therapy appointment on Tuesdays and Thursdays, that he consistently rescheduled, sometimes by hours and sometimes by days, and that the rescheduling annoyed Sylvie in a way she expressed only through the precise and careful manner in which she updated the calendar, her handwriting growing slightly more deliberate with each revision. She learned that his study light was on before 6 every morning and often past 11 at night, and that on the nights it was on past 11, the household moved more quietly the following morning without being asked to. She learned that the woman who came to the house on Wednesday afternoons was named Serena Holt, and that Serena Holt had the kind of beauty that announced itself before she entered a room, the kind that had been cultivated and maintained with the specific dedication of someone who understood it as a professional asset. She was 35, she dressed as if dressing were a professional skill, and she spoke to Marcus with the specific softness of someone who had calculated the exact frequency at which they wanted to be heard low enough to suggest intimacy, clear enough to ensure comprehension. She was Sylvie mentioned once with careful neutrality, his fiancée. Nora absorbed this information and stored it alongside everything else she was storing. She noticed that Serena Holt spent a great deal of time asking questions, not conversational questions, questions with direction to them. She asked about Marcus's schedule in ways that were casual, but specific, framed as the natural interest of a partner in a partner's routine, but oriented toward information that a partner would already have access to. She asked about the kitchen in ways that struck Nora as unusual for someone who, as far as Nora could observe, never cooked and had no particular interest in the domestic operations of the house, except as they related to events. She asked Sylvie once about the security camera coverage near the East Garden entrance, framing it as concern about the property perimeter after she had seen an unfamiliar car on the street. Sylvie answered clearly and moved on. Nora, who was dusting the bookshelf 12 feet away, did not move on. She stored it, the way she stored everything. It was the third week when Rosie found the garden. The children had been given permission to use the small sitting room off the kitchen on the days they came with Nora, and they were largely obedient about staying there. Finn policed it with the serious efficiency of someone who had been responsible for people smaller than himself for long enough that the responsibility had become instinct rather than effort. He positioned himself near the door and maintained a running awareness of who was where and what they were doing and whether any of it required intervention. Mia and Leo occupied themselves with a set of wooden building blocks Sylvie had produced from a storage closet blocks that looked older than the house, worn smooth at the edges by decades of hands. Rosie read or appeared to read until the precise moment when Finn's attention was drawn to Leo tipping the block tower at a dangerous angle. Then she moved. Nora was in the second-floor guest rooms replacing linens when she looked out the window and saw her daughter in the garden below. Rosie had taken off her shoes. She was standing in the snow in her socks, the ones with the small stars on them that she had chosen herself at the discount store on Halstead 3 months ago. Pink stars on white background, already slightly frayed at the toes. She was completely still for a moment, looking at the garden around her, the way she looked at a book she had not opened yet, with the specific attention she brought to new things, and then she began to dance. It was not a performance. It was not the kind of dancing children did when they wanted to be watched or when they wanted to demonstrate something. It was the kind that happened when a person believed they were entirely alone and had something inside them that needed to move through their body before it could settle. Her arms went wide. She turned in a slow circle. She kicked a small arc of snow with her left foot and watched it scatter and fall in the still December air. She did a thing with her hands that had no name, but was entirely her own. Nora put down the pillow she was holding. She was already moving toward the door when she saw him. Marcus Delano was standing at the edge of the garden terrace. He had come from the direction of the study, which faced the garden on the interior side, and he was standing in his coat at the top of the terrace steps, with his hands at his sides and his cane not in use, and he was watching Rosie dance with the kind of attention that people brought to things they were not expecting to see. She could not see his face from where she was standing. She could only see his posture, and what she saw in his posture was something that she did not immediately have words for. The contained quality he carried everywhere was still present, but it had shifted. Something inside his stillness had moved the way a compass moved when it found north. Not dramatically, not with any visible effort, simply orienting toward what it was built to orient toward. He watched for a long time. Then Rosie looked up and saw him. Most children in that position, 8 years old and caught doing something private in a stranger's garden, would have startled, would have bent immediately for their shoes and run for the hedge, and the excuse they would construct on the way back to the sitting room. Rosie Bell looked at the man standing at the edge of the terrace, a man she did not know, a man with a cane and a coat and the unmistakable quality of importance, and she tilted her head to one side and said something to him across the distance of the garden. Nora was too far away to hear it. Marcus Delano crouched down at the top of the terrace steps slowly with the care of someone whose left leg made crouching a considered decision rather than a casual one, and he said something back. Rosie laughed. The sound of it rose through the still December air and reached Nora at the second-floor window, and she felt something in her chest move in a way she was not prepared for. Not fear. Something older than fear. Something that recognized things before the mind had caught up with the recognition. She went back to the linens. That evening, Sylvie mentioned without particular inflection that Mr. Delano had indicated the children were welcome to use the garden on days they visited, provided an adult was present. She mentioned it the way she mentioned most things, as information being conveyed rather than sentiment being expressed. Nora thanked her and gathered her children, and they took the bus home, and she sat at the kitchen table. They were asleep, and she thought about that laugh traveling up through cold December air to a second-floor window. She thought about the quality of attention Marcus Delano had held while watching her daughter dance. She thought about it for a long time. The study was the room she entered last. It was understood to be private in the specific way that important rooms in important houses were private, not forbidden exactly, but weighted, carrying the significance of the person who occupied it in a way that other rooms did not. Nora cleaned it on Thursdays methodically when Marcus was at his rescheduled physical therapy. She dusted the shelves with their rows of books that showed signs of actual reading spines bent gently at particular pages, small slips of paper used as markers. She collected the coffee cups, usually 2 or 3 of them distributed across various surfaces without apparent system. She straightened the newspapers. She had decided from the beginning not to look at the desk in any detail beyond what was necessary for cleaning it. The desk was the center of the room, and it held the working life of a man whose working life was not her business. On the fourth Thursday, she looked at the desk, not because she intended to, because something fell. The drawer on the left side had not been fully closed. She must have caught it with her hip as she reached for a coffee cup on the corner of the desk. It rolled open perhaps 2 inches, and something shifted inside it and slipped from the edge and fell to the floor with a quiet, flat sound, and Nora reached down to pick it up before she had registered what it was. A photograph. She stood up. She stood there for what was probably 30 seconds, but felt much longer holding the photograph in both hands in the study on the fourth floor of the house on Astor Street, and she looked at the face in the image. And she thought with the particular stillness that arrived in her when something was about to change that it was a picture of her. It was not a picture of her. The woman in the photograph was younger than Nora was now, which meant the image had been taken at least 9 years ago, and the face was not Nora's face. But the resemblance was sufficient and arrived quickly enough that her hands had moved toward it before her mind had processed what they were reaching for. Same approximate height and build. Same specific way of holding the shoulders slightly forward as if the body were preparing itself for something. Same shape of the jaw. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting she did not recognize, was a date, 9 years and 3 months ago, and below the date a name. The name was not one she had heard before, but the face she knew, not from her own memory, from photographs in her mother's house, framed on the mantelpiece that had gathered a particular quality of dust over 9 years, because no one had moved them and no one had the heart to clean around them too efficiently. From a story her mother told on certain evenings and did not tell on others, depending on some internal calculus that Nora had never fully decoded. From the shape of an absence that had existed in her family for 9 years. Like a missing tooth, something that had been there and was not, that you kept touching with your tongue to confirm was still gone. The woman in the photograph was the woman her mother still lit a candle for every year on the anniversary. A car accident 9 years ago on a highway outside the city. The kind of accident that entered a family as catastrophe and settled eventually into grief, and then into the long permanent silence that followed grief. Nora placed the photograph carefully back in the drawer and closed it. She finished cleaning the study. She collected the coffee cups. She straightened the newspapers. She walked out and down the hallway and into the kitchen, and she stood at the sink for a long time with the cold water running over her hands. She thought about the face in the photograph. She thought about a car accident 9 years ago. She thought about being 28 years old and 3 months pregnant and already carrying a loss she had not known what to do with when the larger loss arrived and covered it completely. Rosie was 8 years old. Rosie had blue eyes. Not Nora's shade of blue. Not any shade of blue in Nora's family, going back as far as the photographs on her mother's mantelpiece reached. A particular and specific blue, contained and watchful and very much its own. She turned off the water. She dried her hands on the kitchen towel. She walked into the sitting room and looked at her daughter, who was on the floor with a book open in her lap and her brow drawn in slightly, the way it was when she was working through something that resisted easy comprehension. Rosie looked up. She had her mother's height and her mother's way of holding her shoulders, and she had the blue eyes of a man who sat in a room and noticed everything and said very little about what he noticed. Nora sat down on the floor beside her without speaking. She did not touch her face or gather her close or do any of the things the feeling inside her was demanding she do. She sat beside her daughter and breathed and let the understanding settle into her. The way cold settled into a space when the heat was gone, gradually, completely, until there was no part of her that did not hold it. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark of the apartment, with Leo's warmth against her side and the particular sound of Finn's breathing from across the room, slower than it was during the day, more even. And she thought about the photograph and the date on the back and the accident and the 9 years between then and now, and what those 9 years had been built on. In the morning, she dressed the children and made oatmeal and braided Mia's hair and found Finn's left sneaker under Leo's bed, where it had ended up by some logic available only to small boys. And she put them on the bus, and then she sat at the kitchen table alone with her coffee, and she made herself think clearly. She had two questions. The first was about the accident, a car accident 9 years ago on a highway outside the city. She had believed it without question because grief did not invite investigation. Because when the people around you were certain when the police report existed, and the death certificate was filed, and the flowers were sent, and the people gathered in dark clothing, you did not raise your hand and say, "But what if?" You did not ask because you were 28 and pregnant, and already carrying more than you could hold, and adding the possibility of deception to the weight of loss was not something a person could do and remain functional. The second question was about Marcus Delano, a man who had watched her be humiliated in a restaurant he owned and then, without identifying himself, arranged for her employment in his home. A man who kept a photograph in a private drawer. Or a man who had paused on the last step of his staircase and looked at Rosie for a moment that was too long to be casual. She was certain these questions had the same answer. The obvious move was to ask him directly, to take the photograph from the drawer and put it on the desk and say, "Tell me who this is." But Nora had spent 8 years learning that the obvious move was rarely the safest one, that powerful men with answers could also be powerful men with reasons to manage what they gave you and when they gave it, and that once a child was known to a world she had been kept from, she could not be made unknown again. The knowing could not be undone. She needed to understand the full shape of this before she moved. So she went back to work, and she watched more carefully. She watched Serena Holt's Wednesday visits with the specific attention of someone building a pattern rather than observing incidents. She watched the man named Garrett Wynn Marcus's head of operations, who came and went from the house with the easy authority of someone who had been doing so for 2 decades and had stopped distinguishing between his ease in that space and his right to it. He was in his late 50s, trim and efficient, with a face that had the particular quality of faces that had learned long ago to reveal exactly what they intended to reveal and nothing else. He noticed her noticing him once. He was coming out of the study, and she was coming out of the hallway that ran adjacent to it, and they nearly crossed paths, and he looked at her with the brief assessment that people of his type gave to people of her type, categorizing and dismissing in the same motion. And then he smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. She smiled back with the same quality and turned to her work and did not look after him as he continued down the hall. She kept a mental record. She had kept mental records her whole life in the way that people kept them who could not afford to lose information, whose circumstances did not allow for the luxury of forgetting and reconstructing. She recorded Serena's questions about the kitchen layout and the schedule of the kitchen staff. She recorded the specific camera Serena had asked about the East Garden entrance, and she thought about what that camera covered and what it would mean to know its blind spots. She recorded the dates and approximate times of Garrett Wynn's visits, and she recorded the pieces of conversation she caught through partially open doors, small pieces, never the complete picture, but enough to understand direction. In the fourth week, Finn pulled Rosie aside near the tall hedges at the far edge of the garden, while Nora was working nearby with a task Sylvie had assigned. He spoke to her in the low and urgent voice he reserved for things he considered serious. He said that something felt wrong about this place. He said that powerful men did not open their houses to people like them without reasons that would eventually become a problem. He said that kindness from people who had everything was never simple, and they should go back to how things were before. Rosie listened to him the way she listened to Finn, with genuine care, understanding that his worry was a form of love and that his instincts had protected them before and deserved respect. Then she said she did not think he was right about this one. She said she had been watching the man from the garden and through the window, and she thought his heaviness was the kind that came from losing something and not knowing where it went. She said it was not the same as the heaviness that came from having things to hide. Finn said that was not a good reason to trust a stranger. Rosie said she knew, but she did not think he was a stranger anymore. Nora Nurbi heard all of it. She thought about what Rosie had said. She thought about how her daughter had learned to read the quality of someone's sadness from 30 feet away. She thought about what it said about the childhood her daughter had lived, that she had developed that particular skill. She made a decision, not about what to do with what she knew, but about what she needed to find out first and how she was going to find it out and what she was going to do when she did. The DNA results came back on a Tuesday. She was in the hallway outside the study when the courier arrived. She was carrying clean towels from the linen closet at the end of the hall, and the courier came up the main staircase with a sealed envelope and handed it directly to Marcus, who signed for it with the composed brevity of a man receiving something he had arranged to receive. She kept moving. She felt his eyes follow her for a moment before the study door closed. She counted to 10, then she went downstairs and folded towels and waited. Sylvie found her 20 minutes later and told her in the neutral and informative tone she used for most communications that Mr. Delano would like to speak with her when she had a moment. She knocked on the study door. He said, "Come in." She came in and closed the door behind her. I was standing at the window with his back to her. The envelope was open on the desk, the document beside it. She did not look at the document. She looked at the line of his back, at the particular quality of what he was holding in his body. His normal stillness was deliberate, a thing he maintained through some ongoing act of will. What she saw now was different. It was the stillness of a man who had just received information that had rearranged the architecture of the last 9 years. She understood that feeling. She had been carrying her own version of it for weeks. He turned around. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. She held his gaze and did not help him with whatever he was working out how to say. Then he walked to this desk and picked up the photograph, the one from the drawer. He placed it on the surface between them and he said, "Tell me how you knew her." Nora looked at the photograph. Then she looked at him. She said she was someone my family knew. She said it simply, which was the closest version of the truth she was prepared to offer, until she understood more of the shape of what she was standing in. Marcus was quiet. He looked at the photograph and then at Nora, and then at some point past her, the middle distance that people looked at when they were assembling something from pieces. He said, "I loved her." He said it without performance or calculation, the way people said things they had said only inside their own heads for a very long time and had finally said out loud. He said, "I loved her," and then she was gone and no one could explain it in any way that made sense. Nora said, "What did they tell you?" He said that she had left, that she had decided she did not want the life, that she had moved away and not left any contact information. He said it with the flatness of words that had been said so many times internally that they had lost their surface texture, worn smooth by repetition, but still carrying the weight that had never gone away underneath. He had never believed it. She could hear that in the flatness. Nora said, "Who told you that?" He looked at her. She held his gaze without filling the silence. He said one word, "Garrett." The word sat in the room. Nora had known before he said it. She had known it the way she knew things when she had been paying sufficient attention for a sufficient amount of time. But hearing it spoken was different from knowing it. The knowing had been a weight she was carrying. The hearing made it real in a way that changed its texture entirely. She said, "The accident, 9 years ago. A car accident on a highway outside the city." "Were you told about an accident?" He went very still. He said, "What accident?" There it was, the full shape of it, visible all at once. Garrett had told Marcus she left. Garrett had told Nora's family she died. He had constructed two separate stories and placed them on either side of a truth and built 9 years of silence in between them. And those 9 years had produced a child who danced in a garden in star-patterned socks and was now 8 years old and had never known her father and had eyes that matched his exactly. Nora sat down in the chair across from the desk, which she had never done before, and she told him. She told him about the phone call from the police, the accident report, the people in dark clothing at a funeral she remembered in the way you remembered things you had been present for while also being somewhere else entirely inside yourself. She told him about being 28 and 3 months pregnant and already carrying a private loss when the larger public loss arrived and made it impossible to address anything else. She told him about raising Rosie, about the 4 children and the 3 jobs, in the apartment with the drafty window, in the shoes that were a size too small, and the pharmacist who kept a notebook with her name in it. She told him about 11 months at the Harrington without a sick day or a raise or a complaint. He listened, his hands flat on the desk, pressed harder against the surface as she spoke. His face remained composed, but what was underneath it was not. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She has my eyes." Not as a question, as a fact being acknowledged. Nora said yes. He looked at the window. Outside, the garden was winter still, the bare branches of the trees making their dark lines against the pale sky. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "I want to tell her." Nora said, "Not yet." He looked at her. She said it again, "Not yet." She said, "There are things I need to understand before anything changes about Garrett, about what this is and how it happened and whether it is safe for her." He said, "I will handle Garrett." She said, "I know you think you will, but I need you to wait." She said it not as a request, as a necessary condition. He looked at her across the desk with the expression of a man who had not been told to wait in some time. She said, "Do not change how you behave with him. Not yet. Do not let him see that anything has changed." He said, "You have done this before." She said, "I have survived. Those are not the same thing." And she stood up and walked to the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand on the doorknob and her eyes closed. Then she went back to work. The weeks that followed had a particular texture. On the surface, nothing changed. Nora cleaned the house on her schedule, and the children visited on school holidays, and Rosie danced in the garden when the weather permitted, and Marcus watched from the terrace with the restraint of a man holding something with both hands that he was not yet permitted to put down. Nora kept her attention on Garrett Wynn. He came to the house 3 or 4 times a week on average. He moved through it with the easy authority of someone who had been indispensable long enough that indispensable and belonging had merged in his own mind into something he no longer distinguished. He sat in the study with Marcus for hours sometimes. He stood at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee and talked to Sylvie about the household calendar. He reviewed documents in the sitting room. He was everywhere and always had been everywhere. And no one thought to look at that carefully because his everywhereness was what they had always known. She watched him with Serena. They were careful with each other in ways that required noticing to notice. Their conversations were brief and casual when others were present, the specific briefness and casualness of people who had agreed on a register before entering the room. But Nora had spent enough time watching Serena to know her patterns. And one of those patterns was a particular half-second pause before she spoke, a small moment of calculation that appeared consistently when she was navigating something. That pause appeared whenever she spoke to Garrett. It did not appear elsewhere. They shared something they did not share with anyone else in that house. She watched the kitchen. Serena's interest in the kitchen had a direction to it. She knew the kitchen's staff schedule. She knew the location of the specialty pantry supplies. She knew which assistant came on for evening prep and when the head cook left for the day. She had learned all of this through questions spread over several weeks, framed as casual interest, and she had done it carefully. But Nora had been watching her do it and had learned alongside her and had additionally noted a lease document in the study recycling bin in the third week, unshredded, for a facility south of the loop that appeared to have no connection to any Delano Properties projects she could identify. She stored the address from that document the way she stored everything she did not yet understand the use of. There was also the business card, the second Thursday when the drawer had rolled open and she had 11 seconds before she closed it again. She had seen it clearly. Federal government issue, an agent's name and field office address printed on the front. Below the printed number, a handwritten number in different ink, smaller, added later by hand. She had read it once. She stored it. She thought about it often in the weeks that followed. A federal agent's private number in Marcus Delano's desk drawer meant a relationship that existed in the space between official and personal. The kind of relationship where things moved differently than they moved through standard channels. She filed it under things that might become necessary. The night of the engagement party arrived on a Thursday in the coldest week of January. The Crystal Room of the Harrington had been reserved for 2 months. The guest list was 200. The dinner was catered by the Harrington kitchen with a specialty dessert prepared by an outside pastry team Serena had personally selected and contracted without involving Sylvie, which Sylvie had noted in a tone of careful neutrality that told Nora Sylvie had noticed the departure from normal protocol. Nora attended. She told Sylvie that Marcus had requested additional staff for the evening, which was not true, and she delivered it with complete composure, and Sylvie wrote her name on the staff list and said nothing further, which told Nora that Sylvie had her own reasons for not asking questions tonight. The crystal room was exactly what it was designed to be. 200 people who understood they had been included in something sat under chandeliers that made everything look its best and spoke to each other about the things that people who had been included in things spoke about. And at the center of it, Marcus Delano moved with the authority of someone who had spent enough time in rooms like this that the rooms had stopped mattering to him while still clearly mattering to everyone else. Nora moved through the edges of it invisibly, carrying trays, setting things down, being present in the specific way that service staff were present, which was entirely and not at all simultaneously. She watched Serena. Serena was brilliant. She had the performance of the evening down to a level of precision that Nora recognized as the product of considerable planning. She stood beside Marcus with practiced ease that looked like natural ease. She laughed at the right moments and touched his arm at the right moments and spoke to guests with warmth that had been calibrated so carefully it produced an approximation of the real thing that most people in the room could not distinguish from the original. 40 minutes before the dessert course, Serena excused herself toward the kitchen. Nora was already moving. She took the service corridor on a parallel path, carrying a tray of empty glasses, and she positioned herself at the pass-through gap between the kitchen and the staging corridor before Serena had finished her conversation with the pastry assistant. She watched through the gap. The pastry assistant was plating with the focus of someone under time pressure and was not watching Serena. Serena reached across the staging table for a cloth, and in the motion, her hand passed over the bowl of cream filling for the celebration cake. The motion was smooth. It was practiced. It was the kind of movement that required repetition to produce that level of naturalness. Nora had been watching Serena for 4 weeks. She saw the small, folded paper come from Serena's palm. She saw the contents added to the cream in a motion that was part of the reach. She saw Serena's hand come away clean. She set down her tray. She thought very fast. She thought about the children. Rosie had come to the party because Leo had a cough, and Sylvie had suggested it would be easier for Nora to have her nearby. Rosie was at a staff table near the east wall with apple juice and a book. Finn and Mia and Leo were at the residence with Sylvie. She thought about Garrett Wynn standing near the bar on the north wall with a glass of something amber and the particular quality of attention of someone watching a play whose ending they already knew. She started moving toward Marcus. She did not arrive first. Rosie had been at the staff table watching Serena since Serena had moved toward the kitchen because Rosie watched things that seemed out of place, and Serena's movement toward the kitchen had seemed out of place. She had not seen what happened in the kitchen. She had seen Serena's face when the cake left the kitchen. Serena's face had done something for half a second when the cake was carried out by the waitstaff. A specific flicker quickly contained, but not quickly enough for a child who had spent years learning to read what faces did in the half seconds when people thought they were unobserved. When the presentation began and Marcus reached for the serving utensil, Rosie came out of her chair. She moved through the room with the speed of someone small enough to navigate the gaps between adults, and she hit the edge of the cake stand with both hands, and the cake went sideways, and plates and crystals scattered across the tables and the floor, and the room went silent in the way that rooms went silent when 200 people simultaneously understood that something had broken that could not be immediately explained. Rosie stood in the wreckage with cream on her hands and her chest rising and falling hard, and her eyes locked on Marcus, and she said, "Do not eat it." She said she had seen something wrong. She said she had watched and something was wrong and he should not eat it. The room did not breathe. Serena recovered her composure in a fraction of a second and said, of course, nothing had happened. This was a frightened child who had become confused. She said it with compassion that sounded entirely real. She looked at Marcus with the eyes of someone who expected to be believed. Marcus looked at Rosie. He looked at her for a long time. He looked across the room and found Nora at the edge of the table arrived too late, and he read her face. He said quietly that he would like the cream tested independently before anyone consumed it. The physician in attendance tested the cream. The room watched in the hush of 200 people pretending they were not watching. The strip turned dark. The physician said 2 words to Marcus that Nora was close enough to hear. He said it's real. The room understood before any announcement was made. Understanding moved through a crowd faster than announcement and with less control. Serena moved toward the east exit. She stopped when the lead federal agent, who had been positioned at the east entrance on advance information Marcus had provided 3 hours earlier, stepped through the door. She stopped, and she looked at the agent, and she looked at Marcus, and she made the only calculation available to her. She said Garrett's name. She said it clearly and with the specific volume of someone who understood that this was their last useful currency, and they intended to spend it in the room where it would be heard. She said Garrett Wynn gave me the substance. She said he told her which batch to use and when and how to add it without detection. She said he had told her Marcus would not see it coming because Marcus trusted the wrong people. She said he has been planning this for months. The room heard every word. Marcus was completely still. Nora looked at Garrett Wynn. I was at the bar on the north wall. He had not moved during any of it, not when the cake fell, and not when the room went silent, and not when the testing began. He had remained exactly where he was, and she had watched that non-movement from across the room and understood it as calculation rather than shock. Now he put down his glass. He looked at Serena. His expression was not surprise. It was not anger. It was the expression of a man receiving information about which of several prepared outcomes had arrived. Then he looked at Nora. And she saw what she had been looking for through 4 weeks of watching his face across rooms and through gaps in doorways and in hallways where she was moving and he was not watching her move. Relief, not the relief of a man whose associate had been caught and the crisis was contained. The relief of a plan that was still proceeding despite an unexpected variable. Serena being exposed had always been part of it. Serena was not the architecture. Serena was a constructed layer useful and willing, but designed to be findable. Because the purpose of Serena being found was to produce a devastated Marcus, stripped of his fiancée, standing in the wreckage of a betrayal that everyone in this room would witness. And into that wreckage, the loyal constant would step. The 20-year presence. The man who had been there through everything. Garrett Wynn trusted above all others, ready to consolidate everything that Marcus's vulnerability would leave open. He had done this before. 9 years ago, he had used the same basic architecture. A woman who had become important to Marcus in ways that created variables Garrett could not control. He had removed her cleanly. He had given Marcus a story that produced grief without investigation. He had given a family a story that produced a funeral without questions. And then he had waited positioned perfectly closer than ever to the center of everything. I was still waiting, still positioned, still expecting to be the last man standing in a room he had been preparing for 2 decades. He looked at Nora, and she let him see that she knew all of it. She did not conceal it. He let her understanding of the full shape of what he had built be visible in her face because she wanted him to know in this moment that the woman he had not thought worth watching had been watching him for 4 weeks and had seen everything he did not intend to be seen. He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then he moved toward the exit smoothly without urgency the way he moved through everything. Nora moved toward Marcus. She said Garrett is leaving and I need you to listen to me. Marcus looked at her. She said Garrett is not a witness to what happened tonight. He is the reason for tonight. Serena told this room what he gave her and what he instructed, but that is not the beginning of it. She said, I have been in your house for 4 weeks and I know things, and I need you to trust me to use them before you move on him directly. He looked toward the exit where Garrett had gone. She said direct is what he has prepared for. He has spent 20 years preparing for direct inside your life with your trust in your name. She said, I have something he did not prepare for. He said what? She said, I am the person he was not watching. She said it clearly. She said, call the number on the federal agent's card in your second desk drawer, the handwritten number underneath the printed one. Call it tonight before you do anything else and tell the agent that Nora Vell is ready to speak. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He said, how long have you known that number? She said, since the second Thursday. Something moved in his expression. Then he took out his phone. She gathered Rosie and took her into the corridor. Finn had arrived from somewhere, materializing the way he always did when something was wrong, and he was standing near the corridor door with the composed alertness of someone waiting to understand what was required of him. She looked at him and gave him the small nod that meant he should stay where he was and keep the younger ones close. She knelt in front of Rosie. She said, "You were right to do what you did." Rosie said, "I was scared I was wrong." Nora said, "You were not wrong." She said, "The scared part and the doing it anyway part are both what right looks like." Rosie looked at her carefully. Then she said, "He was looking at me again when the room went quiet, the same way he looks at me in the garden." Nora said, "I know." Rosie said, "Is he going to know about me soon?" Nora said, "Yes." Rosie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay," and she said it with the specific equanimity of someone who had been preparing herself for a possibility without knowing its exact shape, and had decided that the shape, whatever it was, could be managed. They drove back to the brownstone, and Nora sat at the kitchen table after the children were asleep, and she wrote things down on a pad of paper. The facility address from the lease document, Garrett's plate number, the partial conversation through the study door, the 3 pieces she had caught, the time of Serena's kitchen visit, and what she had seen. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. She thought about Garrett somewhere in Chicago tonight, recalibrating. Information leverage had failed. The constructed betrayal had been exposed at the wrong moment because an 8-year-old had been paying attention when everyone else in the room was looking at the table setting. When information leverage failed, men, like Garrett, moved to proximity. They reached for what mattered to the person they were trying to control. Her children were in a brownstone in Wicker Park. She called Marcus. He answered immediately. She said she needed confirmation that Garrett did not know this address. Not reassurance. Confirmation. She said, "Call the agent tonight. Tell him there is a woman named Nora Vell with corroborating information." She read the number from memory. He said, "I will handle it." She said, "Do not contact Garrett. Let him believe he is still ahead of this." I said, Nora. She waited. He said, "Thank you." He said it without decoration, which was the right way. She hung up. In the morning, she got the children ready, and Marcus arrived at 9, looking like he had not slept, which she had expected. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the children, and when he looked at Rosie, the thing in his face was not controlled. Rosie looked back at him and said, "Good morning." He said, "Good morning." Leo held up his spoon and announced there was no brown sugar. Marcus said he would see what he could do. He said it with complete seriousness, as if the matter deserved it. Leo appeared satisfied. Marcus and Nora went to the end of the kitchen. He said the agent had been waiting for an entry point for 14 months. He said the words told her what she needed to know about how long something had been building in directions she had only seen from the outside. She said, "Where is Garrett?" He said, "At his office. His routine has not changed." She said, "He will move today. When proximity leverage fails, he moves to direct confrontation. He will want to be in the room where the story is written." She said, "I need to be the one who closes this, not you. If you move directly on him, it becomes a confrontation on terrain he has spent 20 years preparing." She said, "I have something he cannot account for. He has never once considered me worth accounting for." He said, "I understand." She said, "Do not follow me." He said, "Be careful." She kissed Rosie and touched Mia's shoulder and held Leo's face in her hands for a moment and looked at Finn, who looked back at her steadily. Then she left. She took the bus to the Loop and went to the coffee shop across from Garrett's building and sat at the window with something she did not drink, and she waited. He came out at 11:47 with one man walking north. She followed at half a block, moving the way she had moved through rooms her whole life, without friction, without drawing attention, simply present in the space between other people's awareness. They stopped at a parking structure 2 blocks north. Garrett's man went ahead into the structure. Garrett took out his phone. She watched his face from the corner and saw the direction he was looking, which was northwest. He had the address. She called Marcus without taking her eyes off Garrett. She told him to move the children immediately. She gave him the secondary address. She said to call the agent and give him the Wicker Park address and tell him there were children in the building. She hung up. She watched Garrett for 4 minutes. His man came back out and spoke to him and went back in. And Garrett's expression shifted as someone on the phone told him something. The address was being cleared. He was adjusting. She knew where he would go. She called the agent directly. She gave her name. She gave the facility address from the lease document. She said she believed Garrett Wynn would be there within the hour. The voice said, "Can you get there?" She said yes. The voice said, "Maintain safe distance. Do not engage." Shilpa took the bus south. She positioned herself in the adjacent loading dock area with a sight line to the facility entrance and she waited in the December cold with her hands in her pockets. Garrett arrived at 12:31. He came alone, which confirmed what she had understood about his confidence. He still believed he was the person who controlled the outcome of this. He went inside. At 12:47, two federal vehicles pulled up. Four agents came out, and behind them Marcus. She had told him not to come. She crossed the lot. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s, looked at her and said, "You are Vel." Nora said yes. The agent said, 14 months. She said we needed an entry point. She looked at Nora the way someone looked at a thing they recognized and respected. She said, "You gave us the entry point." They went inside. Garrett was in the central room. He had heard the vehicles. He was standing with the stillness of someone who has recalculated and is deciding on a presentation for a situation he did not fully anticipate, but has partially prepared for. He looked at Marcus first, then the agents, then Nora. She watched him find the answer to how she had arrived here before him. She watched him understand it, and she watched what the understanding cost him. He said, "You spent a month cleaning a house." She said, "I did." He said, "How?" She said, "Because I was the person you were not watching." She said it without satisfaction. She said, "You built everything on knowing where the power was. But power is not the only thing worth watching." I was quiet. Then he looked at Marcus. He said, 20 years. He said it with something genuine in it, the specific grief of someone burning something they also valued. He said, "Everything you have, I helped you build." Marcus said, "I know." He said it without anger. He had passed through the anger in the night and arrived somewhere more resolute. The agents moved forward, and Garrett's hands came up and the procedure began. And in the last moment before he cleared the doorway, he turned his head and he said what he had saved to say the final piece, the information he had preserved to spend at the moment when it would land heaviest. He said, "Your father made the call 9 years ago. I executed it, but the order was his." He said the old man decided she was not suitable. He asked me to handle it cleanly. He said, "I am not the only one who owes you something." Then he was through the door and gone. The room was very quiet. Marcus stood completely still. Nora stood completely still. The December light came through the high industrial windows and fell between them across the concrete floor, and neither of them spoke for a long time. He turned and looked at her. She looked back at him. She thought about the photograph in the drawer. She thought about a funeral with flowers and people in dark colors. She thought about being 28 years old and carrying two losses at once and having no way to know that one of them was constructed. She thought about a man she had never met, deciding she was not suitable, not qualified, not the right kind of person for his son's life, and instructing the person closest to that son to make her gone cleanly. She thought about Rosie, 8 years old, blue eyes, running through a room full of 200 important people and hitting a cake stand with both hands because she had seen something wrong and had not waited for permission to act on it. She said, "Is it true?" Marcus said, "I do not know yet." She said, "If it is." He said, "If it is, then there is more than one reckoning in front of me." He said it with the weight of someone who meant it completely. She said, "Yes." He said, "I am sorry. For all of it. For the parts I caused without knowing, and the parts done in my name, and the parts done by the people I kept close." He said, "I understand if that is not enough." She said, "It is something, and it is not enough. And both of those things are true at the same time." He said, "What do you want?" She said, "I want Rosie to know her father. On her terms, not on terms decided by anyone else. I want to make that decision with her, not for her." She said it without apology. She said, "And I want you to understand that I am not interested in being managed. I have been taking care of myself and 4 children for 8 years, and I am capable of continuing to do so." He said, "Those are conditions." She said, "Yes." I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have spent 20 years being the one who set conditions." She said, "I know." He said, "This is going to require me to be different." She said, "Yes, and that takes time to do correctly." She said it not unkindly. She said it the way she said true things, directly and without decoration. He said, "I would like to come to the brownstone." She said, "Come at 5. I will talk to Rosie first." He said, "All right." Shaw took the bus back. She sat at the window of the brownstone and she talked to Rosie while the others were in the other room. She told her enough. She told her who Marcus was and how and what she knew about the 9 years and what she did not yet know and what she intended to find out. She told her that she did not have to do anything she did not want to do, and she did not have to feel anything she did not feel, and she did not have to be ready for any of it before she was ready. Rosie listened the way she listened to things that mattered entirely without interrupting. When Nora finished, Rosie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have been watching him for weeks. I think I know what he is. She said, I want to find out if I am right. Marcus arrived at 5. Finn answered the door. He stood in the doorway and he looked at Marcus Delano with the full and unconcealed assessment of someone who had not learned to soften the honesty of his attention. He was 10 years old and he had been this person who stood between his family and whatever was coming for as long as he could remember. And he was not going to stop doing that simply because the person at the door was tall. Marcus looked back at him without softening anything either. He met the boy on his own terms. Finn said, Are you going to be around? Marcus said, I hope to be. He said, if that is all right with you. Finn considered this for a long time. Then he stepped back and held the door open. Marcus came inside and Leo showed him the block structure on the kitchen floor, which was impressive in its ambition and precarious in its execution. Marcus sat down in his coat on the kitchen floor and looked at it with genuine attention. He suggested reinforcing the left base. Leo considered this advice and incorporated it. Mia showed him her drawing of the brownstone. He said it was very accurate. He said it the way he said things he actually meant. Finn came and sat at the table. He picked up Mia's drawing and looked at it. He did not say anything, but he stopped standing at the door. Rosie came in last. She walked across the kitchen and sat down on the floor across from Marcus. And she looked at the block structure and she said, You are building from the center. That is the problem. She said, build the edges first and work inward. It is more stable. She began moving blocks. Marcus watched her hands. He said, Where did you learn that? She said, From watching. She said, You can learn most things from watching if you stay patient. He said, I think that is true. They worked on the structure together. Rosie directed and Marcus executed her instructions with full seriousness, and Leo contributed blocks with enthusiasm, invariable accuracy. After a while, without looking up, Rosie said, I know who you are. Marcus went still. She said, I have known for a little while. She said, I was deciding how I felt about it. He said, and she looked up at him. She said, I think I want to try. She said, I do not know what that looks like yet, but I want to find out. He looked at his daughter. He looked at her with the expression he had been carrying since the morning he came down the staircase and stopped on the last step and looked at an 8-year-old girl in an entrance hall and felt something rearrange itself inside him without warning or permission. He said, So do I. Rosie looked at him for a moment longer. Then she went back to the blocks. She said, We need 3 more on the left side before we go up another layer. He said, I see it. Nora stood in the doorway. She watched her daughter teaching her father something in a kitchen in Wicker Park on a Wednesday in December, and she felt something that had no single name being made of too many things at once. Grief for 9 years of a life constructed on a lie. Relief that the lie had been found. The complicated particular joy of things that arrived in the wrong order and were still, despite the order, worth having. She thought about what came next, the legal proceeding, the investigation, the reckoning with what Garrett had said about Marcus's father, which was a thread she had no intention of leaving unexamined. The long, uncertain work of building something new in a space where something broken had been. Rosie's questions, arriving in waves over years, the ones Nora could answer and the ones she could not. There would be a great deal. But the immediate danger had passed. Her children were safe. The man who had spent 20 years arranging other people's lives from inside the trust they extended to him was in federal custody. And Nora Vell, who cleaned houses and took buses and had not been considered worth watching, had been the one who put him there. She had done it the way she had done everything in her adult life. By paying attention in the rooms where no one paid attention to her. By storing what she saw until she understood what it was for. By refusing in the end to be only what other people had decided she was. Outside Chicago continued in its December evening, the lake wind and the traffic and the gray particular light of the city in winter. The kind of place that did not ask if you were ready for it and did not apologize for what it cost to live in it. She had been ready for a long time without knowing exactly what she was ready for. Rosie looked up from the blocks and found her mother in the doorway. She smiled. Nora smiled back. The structure on the kitchen floor built from the edges inward at the direction of an 8-year-old girl in star-patterned socks held. There were things about the house on Astor Street that Nora had learned in stages, the way you learn things that were too large to absorb all at once. She had learned the geography of it in the first week. The layout of the rooms, the flow of the household, the points where the private in the professional met, in the points where they were kept carefully apart. She had learned which doors opened easily and which ones required the specific knowledge of how to lift slightly before turning. She had learned that the third step on the back stair had a loose board that made a sound, and that this mattered because the back staircase was the one the staff used most frequently, and it meant that sound traveled in that part of the house in ways it did not travel elsewhere. She had learned the rhythms of it in the second week, when Marcus was in the house and when he was not, when Garrett Wynn would arrive and how long he would stay, when Serena's Wednesday visits started and when they ended, and what path she took through the house on her way in and out. She had learned that Sylvie worked to a schedule so consistent it could have been used as a clock, and that this consistency meant deviations from it were immediately significant. She had learned its silences in the third and fourth weeks. Every house had a particular quality of silence, the kind that was its own when nothing was happening in it, and the Delano house had one that was heavy and expensive and old, the silence of a place that had held things for a long time. She had learned to hear the difference between the silence of the house when Marcus was in the study and the silence when he was not, which was a smaller and less specific silence without weight at its center. She thought about these things on the bus rides home at the end of her shifts, looking out the window at Chicago, moving past in its winter gray, and she thought about what it meant to know a space so well you could hear it thinking. She had never been trained for any of this. She had simply learned that the world did not protect people like her, and that therefore people like her had to protect themselves, and that protection required information, and that information required attention, and that attention required being the kind of person that other people did not think to watch. She had been that kind of person her whole life. She had been that person in every restaurant she had worked in every hotel corridor she had cleaned, and every waiting room she had sat in. She had been invisible in the specific way that working women were invisible in spaces that did not consider them part of the scene, and she had used that invisibility the way she used every other resource available to her, as efficiently as she could without waste. What she had not anticipated was that the invisibility would one day position her to see something that changed everything. She thought about Rosie. She thought about the morning of the snow day, the first morning at the Delano house when she had been settling the children in the entrance hall, and Marcus Delano had come down the staircase and stopped on the last step and looked at Rosie before he looked at anything else. She had registered it then as the particular quality of attention that adults sometimes gave to children who reminded them of something. She had not understood what she was seeing. She understood it now with a clarity that was almost physical, as if the understanding had weight and dimension and occupied space as far to her the way solid things occupied space. He had looked at Rosie and seen his own eyes looking back at him. She thought about what 9 years of not knowing that felt like. She thought about what it meant to have loved someone and then been told a story about that love that made the love irrelevant, that turned it into something that had simply ended, that required only grief and not investigation. She thought about carrying that story for 9 years and what it did to a person to carry it. She thought about what Garrett Wynn had built on top of it. 20 years of positioned loyalty, 20 years of being the one person closest to the center of Marcus Delano's life, trusted above all others, present in every significant moment, shaping the information that Marcus received about his own empire and his own life. 20 years of steering and adjusting and constructing the narrative that Marcus lived inside. It was in its way an extraordinary thing. Nora could recognize its architecture even as she understood exactly what it had cost. She thought about her daughter's blue eyes. She thought about what those 9 years had cost Rosie. Not what Rosie had lost, which was the obvious way to think about it, but what Rosie had become in the absence of it. The girl who read 12 books at a time and danced in gardens she had not been invited into and ran through rooms full of important people because she had seen something wrong, and the seeing of it made action necessary. The girl who watched faces until she understood them and who had learned to read the quality of a sadness from 30 feet away because the world she had grown up in required that particular skill. Rosie was extraordinary. She was extraordinary because she had been raised by a woman who had to be extraordinary in order to keep her alive and housed and fed and educated and loved, and extraordinary mothering produced extraordinary children, and what had been taken from Rosie was not what she had become, but the witness to her becoming. the person who should have been there to watch her grow into what she was. Nora thought about that. She thought about it on the bus rides home and in the kitchen after the children were asleep and in the hour before dawn, when she lay in the dark and let herself think about the things she could not address during the day. She did not think about it with bitterness exactly. Bitterness required energy she had never been able to spare. But she thought about it with a kind of deep and precisely located grief, the grief of something that had been taken rather than simply lost, which was a different kind of grief entirely. And she thought about what she was going to do about it. In the days between the DNA results and the night of the engagement party, Nora had continued her work in the house with the same competence and the same invisibility she had always brought to it, and she had continued watching Garrett win, and she had continued building her understanding of the shape of what he had constructed. She had found the lease document on a Thursday morning in the third week. She had been collecting recyclables from the study, which was part of her Thursday routine, and the document had been placed in the recycling bin folded but not shredded, which told her something about how Garrett Wynn operated. He was careful in the ways he thought mattered and careless in the ways he did not consider significant. He had shredded other documents that week she had heard the machine running. He had not shredded this one because it did not appear important by itself, because it was only meaningful if you connected it to something else, and the something else was not visible to anyone who was simply looking at a lease document for a facility in an industrial corridor south of the Loop. But Nora had been watching Garrett for 3 weeks by then. She had been listening to his partial conversations and noting the directions they moved in and the names that recurred in them. She had an understanding of the operational structure. He maintained the pieces of it she could see from her position, and this document connected to that structure in a way she recognized. She read the address, and she stored it, and she put the document back in the recycling bin, and she moved on. She had also found other things, small things individually meaningless, that accumulated into a picture when laid against each other. The name of a financial institution mentioned in a call she caught 3 words of. The license plate of a vehicle she had never seen before parked in the driveway at an angle that suggested it had not parked there before and was uncertain of the protocol. The specific way Garrett handled his phone when he was in the house, which was to move to the far end of whatever room he was in before answering it, even when the house appeared empty, which suggested his calls contained information he did not want to risk being overheard. She stored all of it. She stored it in the specific way she had been storing things her entire adult life, organized and precise and available for recall without warning. She had not known yet what she would use it for. And then she had been in the service corridor at the Harrington with a tray of empty glasses, and she had watched through a gap in a door, and she had understood what she would use it for. The morning after the engagement party in the brownstone in Wicker Park, Nora sat at the kitchen table while the house was still quiet, and she thought about the federal agent whose private number was in Marcus Delano's desk drawer. She thought about what it meant that the number was handwritten below the printed one. It meant the agent had given it to Marcus personally outside of the official channel. It meant there was a relationship there that existed on personal terms as well as professional ones. It meant that if she called that number and said the right things, the response would not be the response of an official channel, which was slow and procedural and required layers of verification. The response would be the response of a person who had an existing investment in the outcome. She thought about what she had to offer. She had a lease document address. She had a license plate number. She had dates and times and fragments of conversations and the specific behavioral patterns of a man who had been running something for 20 years inside another man's trust. She had in the service corridor of the Harrington been a witness to an act of attempted poisoning, and she had the memory of what she had seen with the precise clarity that her memory had always provided. She had enough, not for everything, not for the full scope of what Garrett Wynn had done over 20 years, but enough for a beginning. Enough for the kind of entry point that an investigation that had been waiting for one would recognize immediately. She had called Marcus and told him what she needed. Then she had sat alone in the quiet kitchen and thought about Rosie dancing in the garden in her star-patterned socks. And she had thought about the next morning when she would put on her coat and go out into Chicago in December and use everything she had spent 4 weeks accumulating. She had not been afraid. This surprised her slightly when she noticed it. She had expected fear. Fear was a reasonable response to the situation. But what she felt instead was something closer to resolution, the particular quality of arriving at a point that had been approaching for some time. She had been moving toward this since the Thursday she found the photograph in the drawer. She had been moving toward it in another sense since the night 9 years ago when she was 28 and pregnant and making decisions alone about a life that had been altered without her consent. She had been moving toward this her entire adult life, every job and every bus ride and every careful act of attention and storage and patience. Everything had been preparation for this specific application of what she had learned. She was ready. She went to sleep for 4 hours in the brownstone in Wicker Park, and she woke up before the children, and she made coffee, and she sat at the table, and she thought about what she was going to do, and in what order she was going to do it. And then the children woke up and the morning began. Later, she would think about the moment in the facilities south of the Loop, when Garrett Wynn looked at her and said, "You spent a month cleaning a house." She would think about the specific quality of what was behind that statement, which was not really a statement. It was an acknowledgement. It was a man who had spent 20 years knowing exactly what every piece on the board was capable of, looking at a piece he had miscategorized and acknowledging the miscategorization. She had been in rooms her whole life where she was miscategorized. She had been the waitress and the housekeeper and the woman with the difficult situation. She had been the name in the notebook under the counter at the pharmacy, the person who needed $4.80 extended to her on credit. She had been all of those things genuinely without apology because they were true things about her life. But she had also been the person watching. She had also been the person storing. She had also been the person who was patient enough and careful enough and attentive enough to be in the right position at the right moment with the right information, and who was prepared enough to use it when the moment arrived. Garrett Wynn had built his entire operation on knowing where the power was and staying close to it. He had understood power in one direction only as something that flowed from resources and position and access. He had not understood that there was another kind of power, slower and less visible, that came from being the person in the room that no one watched. She had understood that for a long time. She had just never before had occasion to use it at this particular scale. In the brownstone that final evening, after Marcus had come and sat on the kitchen floor and helped with the blocks and said good morning to Rosie, and been looked at steadily by Finn and been shown Mia's drawing with full seriousness, Honora stood in the doorway, and she thought about what came next. There was a great deal that came next. There was the matter of Marcus's father, which Garrett had deployed like a weapon in his last moment, because that was the kind of man he was using information as leverage right to the end. The old man had made the call. He had decided Nora was not suitable. He had asked for it to be handled cleanly. Whether this was true or whether it was one final act of misdirection, a dying strike to put a fracture between Marcus and the woman who had helped bring Garrett down, she did not yet know. But she intended to find out, and she did not intend to be managed in the finding out. She would look at what the evidence showed, and she would form her own assessment, and she would not be told what to think about it by anyone whose interests were served by her thinking one thing rather than another. There was the matter of Rosie and what she would need over the coming months and years. There was the father she had just met and the questions she would have about the 9 years before this, and the ones she would have about the 9 years ahead of this. And those questions would not be simple, and the answers would not be simple, and the work of making space for all of it was going to be real and ongoing. There was the matter of Finn, who had held the door open, which was not nothing. Finn, who had adjusted his expectations and stopped asking for things and stood between his family and whatever was coming for so long that it had become his nature. Finn needed to not be the one doing that anymore, and that required someone else being reliable enough that the job could be set down, and that was not a simple thing to achieve or a quick one. There was Mia with her drawings and Leo with his blocks in the apartment in Bridgeport, in the apartment's drafty window, in the question of what the next chapter of their lives looked like, and who had standing to participate in answering that question and on whose terms. All of it was ahead of her. She looked at the kitchen, at the block structure that had been built from the edges inward and was now genuinely stable at her daughter's small hands, moving one last block into place at the man sitting on the kitchen floor in his coat, watching her do it with an expression that he was no longer trying to manage or contain. She looked at Finn at the table, who was looking at all of it with the carefully neutral expression of someone withholding judgment until more data arrived. She looked at Mia pressed against Finn's arm, and Leo already forgetting the drama of the day in favor of the interesting question of what happened if you added one more block to the very top. She thought about a girl dancing in a garden in star-patterned socks in December snow, her arms wide, her face turned up, moving through something that needed to move. She thought about a photograph in a drawer. She thought about a name written on the back of a photograph in someone else's handwriting. She thought about 9 years and what they had cost and what they had made and what they were going to become now. She was 37 years old. She had 4 children and a coat that needed replacing and a pharmacist who kept a notebook under the counter. She had grown up in a world that had not considered her sufficient and had spent her adult life proving that assessment wrong in every room she entered without ever announcing that she was doing it. She had paid attention when no one paid attention to her. She had been patient when patience was the only tool available. She had waited until she understood the full shape of what she was inside before she moved, and when she moved, she had moved precisely and she had not missed. Outside the brownstone, the city continued. Chicago in December, flat and gray and cold and enormous, indifferent, in the specific way of places that had been surviving longer than anyone currently in them. The lake wind moved through the streets. The traffic on the expressway made its constant sound. The lights of the city were coming on in the early dark of a winter evening. She was still standing. She had, when she thought about it, always been standing. Rosie looked up from the blocks and found her mother in the doorway and smiled, and the smile was Rosie's own smile, made of things that were entirely hers and had always been hers and would always be hers, regardless of what 9 years had or had not contained. Nora smiled back. The structure held. In those weeks between the DNA results and the party, the garden had become a place of a particular kind of tension, beautiful on the surface and charged underneath with things that neither Marcus nor Nora was prepared yet to say aloud. Rosie went to it every time she came to the house. She went the way she went to books, with the specific intention of someone who knew what they wanted from a thing and was prepared to be patient about getting it. She would appear in the garden in her star-patterned socks, regardless of the temperature, and she would find whatever corner or path suited her, and she would move through the space on her own terms. And sometimes Marcus would be at the terrace when she arrived, and sometimes he would appear after she had been there for a while, and they would speak to each other across the distance with the slightly formal care of two people who both understood that something significant was present between them and had agreed without words to approach it carefully. Nora watched these exchanges from windows and doorways when she could, and from her imagination when she could not. And she thought about what it meant for an 8-year-old to navigate a situation this complex with the grace that Rosie brought to it. Rosie did not perform for Marcus. That was the thing Nora noticed most acutely. She did not try to be what she thought he might want her to be, or adjust herself to the shape of his attention. She was simply herself entirely and without apology. And this turned out to be the most powerful thing she could have offered him, because what Marcus Delano had built his entire life around was the management of what people saw and knew of him. And here was a child who had no interest in that game. She asked him things directly. She asked him once why he did not use the garden himself when it was clearly very good. He told her he had been busy, and she said that did not seem like a real reason. And he had been quiet for a moment, and then said she was probably right. She asked him once why there were no pictures of anyone on the walls of the study. He said he did not know what she meant, and she said the walls had pictures of buildings and landscapes, but no pictures of people, and she wondered if that was a choice or if it had just happened that way. He said it had probably just happened that way. She said that seemed like something worth fixing. Nora heard about these conversations afterward from Rosie, who reported them the way she reported everything she found worth noting, accurately and without embellishment. She thought about them at night. She thought about what it meant that her daughter had looked at a man's study full of pictures of buildings and landscapes and said, "There are no people on these walls," and the man had not had an answer for it. She thought about what it meant that the first person in a very long time to look at Marcus Delano's life and say plainly and without agenda, "This is missing something," was an 8-year-old girl who was his own daughter and had not known it. She thought about what Rosie had seen in the garden the first day. The man sitting alone with something heavy in his posture. The heaviness that came from holding something for so long that you had almost forgotten the weight of it. She thought about a child who had been attentive enough to her own circumstances to recognize that particular kind of caring in someone else. She She thought about what it did to a person carrying something for 9 years without anywhere to put it. She thought about herself and Marcus, both in different cities, in different kinds of silence, carrying different versions of the same absence. She thought about Garrett Wynn moving through both of those silences, like a man walking through rooms he owned, adjusting the furniture slightly with every pass, making sure the spaces remained shaped the way he needed them. She thought about how long a person could do that before someone noticed. In this case, 20 years. In this case, the person who finally noticed was a woman who cleaned the rooms and was therefore inside them in a way that no one who mattered thought to account for. She had noticed. She had paid attention. And now she had done what came after paying attention, which was to use what you had learned at the moment when using it could produce the most significant result. That was the whole of it when you stripped away the drama and the fear and the late nights at kitchen tables. She had paid attention, and she had been patient, and she had moved when the moment required it. These were not extraordinary skills. They were the skills of someone who had been surviving in circumstances that did not forgive inattention or impatience or premature movement. She had been preparing her whole life without knowing for what. Danny, who owned the pharmacy on Halsted and kept the notebook under the counter, had asked her once in the friendly and impersonal way. He asked things whether she had always been so observant or whether it was something she had developed. She had thought about this for a moment and said she was not sure it was really observant so much as necessary. I had said that was a very interesting distinction. She had taken her acetaminophen and said she thought about it sometimes. She was thinking about it in the brownstone in Wicker Park, watching her daughter and her daughter's father work together on a block structure that Rosie had decided was going to be stable if she had anything to say about it. It was interesting, she thought, how the things you learned in order to survive sometimes turned out to be the things that made other things possible. The attention she had developed because she could not afford to miss things had become the attention that let her see what Garrett Wynn was, and what he was doing, and where he was going to be. The patience she had developed because impatience was a luxury had become the patience that let her wait until she had enough to act. The precision she had developed because imprecision had consequences she could not absorb had become the precision that let her report a facility address and an agent's private number from memory without hesitation. You learned things for the reasons you had, and you used them for the reasons that arrived. She had not chosen the reasons she had, but she had used what she learned from them, and this had turned out to matter more than she had known it would when she was learning it. Rosie said something to Marcus, and he laughed a short, genuine sound that Nora had not heard him produce before, and Leo looked up from his block pile with delight at the fact of it, this unexpected new thing in the room that sounded like something he recognized. Nora thought about the years ahead. She thought about them without the particular dread that had accompanied thoughts of the future for so long. She had stopped fully noticing it. The dread had been the background color of every plan she had made for 8 years, the low-frequency awareness that the margin was thin and that thin margins broke without warning. That dread was not gone entirely. She was not sure it ever became entirely gone for people who had lived inside it long enough, but it had shifted. It had shifted because the thing that had been doing the most damage was now visible and named and in federal custody, and because the resources available to her 4 children had changed in ways that were real and not theoretical, and because she had just demonstrated to herself as much as to anyone else that she was capable of considerably more than the margin of her circumstances had suggested. She had known this in the way you knew things about yourself, that the circumstances did not create opportunities to demonstrate. She had always known she was capable. The question had always been whether capability was sufficient, whether paying attention and being patient and moving carefully when you moved was enough when the forces against you were this large and this old and this embedded. It had turned out to be enough. Just barely, and with a great deal of work, and with an 8-year-old girl who ran through a room full of important people because she had seen something wrong, but enough. Enough was all she had ever been trying for. She pushed off the doorframe. She walked into the kitchen. She sat down at the table across from Finn, who was watching the block construction with the expression of someone performing careful neutrality while feeling something more complicated underneath it. She said, "What are you thinking?" I looked at her. He said, "I am thinking it is going to be different now." She said, "Yes." He said, "Is different going to be okay?" She thought about this for a moment. She thought about Finn, 10 years old, who had stopped asking for things and started observing what was available and adjusting his expectations accordingly. She thought about what it would mean for him to have the ability to adjust his expectations upward. She said different is going to be a lot of work. She said it is not going to be simple or fast. She said there will be things that are harder and things that are easier and things we cannot predict in either direction. He said that is not an answer. She said, I know. She said, I think it is going to be okay. She said, I think we are going to make it okay. She said, I am not promising you it will be easy. I am telling you that I am going to be here and I am going to keep paying attention and I am going to handle what needs handling. She said the way I always have. I looked at her for a moment. Then he said, yeah. He said it in the specific way that 10-year-olds said, yeah, when they meant something larger than the word, when they were choosing to extend the benefit of the doubt based on evidence rather than hope. She said, yeah. And across the kitchen, Rosie placed the final block on the left side of the structure, and it held, and Leo made a sound of profound satisfaction, and Marcus looked at his daughter and did not look away. There was one more thing that Nora thought about that night after the children were asleep and the brownstone was quiet, and she was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. She thought about Serena Holt. She thought about a woman who had been willing, who had received a substance from a man she trusted and had added it to a bowl of cream, filling in a kitchen in the Harrington, and had then gone out and stood beside the man she was supposed to marry and smiled the smile she had practiced and waited for the thing to unfold the way it had been designed to unfold. She thought about what it took to be that woman, what you had to have decided or had decided for you about what you were willing to do and what you were not. Whether Serena had understood the full scope of what she was participating in, or whether she had been given a version of it that made it manageable, that made it an act of self-interest rather than something darker. Whether Garrett had chosen her specifically because she was the kind of person who could be given a partial story and could be relied upon not to ask the questions that would reveal the rest of it. She thought about the way Serena had said Garrett's name in the crystal room, loudly, clearly, with the specific volume of someone spending their last currency in the room where it would do the most damage to the person who had given it to them. There had been something almost admirable in the precision of it, the recognition that she was caught, and the immediate pivot to the move that gave her the most to work with going forward. Nora did not feel sympathy for Serena exactly, but she felt something adjacent to it, the understanding that people arrived at their worst decisions through a series of smaller ones that had seemed manageable at the time, and that the distance between the person who said yes to a first small request and the person who emptied a folded paper into a bowl of cream filling was sometimes shorter than it appeared from the outside. She thought about what her own version of that distance looked like. She had never been in a position where someone powerful wanted something from her that she could provide. She had been in positions where powerful people wanted her gone, which was different. She thought about what she would have done at 28, exhausted and pregnant, and told by someone she had reason to trust that this was what needed to happen. She thought about whether she would have asked the questions that revealed the rest of the story or whether she would have accepted the version that made it manageable. She hoped she would have asked. She was fairly certain she would have asked because asking was in her nature and always had been the restless need to understand the full shape of a thing before she committed to it. But she was also honest enough to recognize that certainty about your own behavior in hypothetical situations was a form of vanity, and that the circumstances people found themselves in were never exactly the circumstances they had prepared for. She put down the cold cup of tea. She thought about tomorrow. Tomorrow she would call her mother. She had been thinking about this for weeks and had not known how to begin it and still did not know exactly how to begin it. But she knew it needed to happen and she knew she was the one who had to do it. Her mother had lit a candle every year for 9 years. Her mother had built a particular architecture of loss around what Garrett Wynn had constructed, and that architecture was real and had its own weight, and dismantling it was not going to be simple or quick. But the truth was available now. The truth was real, and it could be verified, and it would be verified through the federal investigation and through whatever legal proceedings followed, and her mother deserved to have it, even if having it meant rebuilding something from a different foundation than the one she had been standing on. She thought about her mother hearing it. She thought about what it would do to her, the specific quality of grief that would arrive when she understood that the loss she had been mourning for 9 years had a different shape than she had believed. Not smaller, in some ways larger, but differently distributed. The person she had been grieving was more present in the world than she had known present in the form of an 8-year-old girl with blue eyes and star-patterned socks who danced in gardens and ran through ballrooms and read 12 books at a time. She thought about her mother meeting Rosie. She thought about Rosie meeting her grandmother. She thought about the specific and exact way that Rosie would look at a new person and assess them and make her determination about what they were and whether they were worth her attention. And she thought about how long it would take approximately before Rosie had figured out her grandmother completely and had started asking the kinds of direct questions that Rosie asked when she had decided someone was worth asking them of. Not long, she thought. Not long at all. She allowed herself to feel something that she had not allowed herself to feel in some time. Not happiness exactly, because happiness was too simple a word for the mixture of things she was carrying, but something in that neighborhood, something that lived on the same street as Hope and had been knocking on the door for a few hours and was now cautiously being let in. She washed the cup. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and she listened to the brownstone around her. Its particular quality of silence, different from the silence of the apartment in Bridgeport, different from the silence of the Delano house, its own thing entirely. She listened to the breathing of her children in the other rooms. She thought about the block structure on the kitchen floor built from the edges inward stable, in a way it had not been before Rosie decided it needed to be. She closed her eyes. Outside Chicago continued in its January dark. The lake wind and the traffic and the lights of a city that had been surviving longer than anyone in it. She had been surviving in it for 37 years. She had been paying attention for 37 years, and she had been patient for 37 years, and she had, in the end, been ready when the moment required it. She thought about the garden on Astor Street. She thought about snow and the particular quality of winter light on garden walls and a child who had taken off her shoes and stood in that light and moved through something that needed to move through her without audience, without performance, without anything except the need to be in motion. She thought about what it meant to be seen doing that. She thought about what it meant that the first person to see it had looked and had not looked away. She slept. In the morning, Rosie was awake before anyone else and was sitting at the kitchen table with a book when Nora came out. She did not look up immediately, finishing the sentence she was on, and then she looked up and said good morning with the particular clarity of someone whose mind had already been active for some time before the body caught up. Nora said good morning. She started coffee. After a moment, Rosie said, "Are we going to be okay?" Nora did not answer immediately. She measured coffee and she listened to the sound of the other children, not yet stirring in the other room. And she thought about what okay meant and what it would take to get there and how long it would take and whether the getting there was something she could promise without knowing its shape. She said yes. She said it without qualification. Not probably, not I think so, not I am going to do everything I can. She said yes the way she said true things directly and without decoration. Rosie looked at her for a moment. Then she said okay and went back to her book. The coffee maker made its sound. Outside the brownstone window, Chicago was beginning its morning, the light coming up gray and flat over the January streets, the city assembling itself again from the dark, the way it did every day as a fact rather than an achievement, as if any other outcome had never been under consideration. Nora thought that was the right way to do it. She poured her coffee. She sat down across from her daughter. She said, "What are you reading?" Rosie told her. The morning began.